the Justice Department with the latest. David.
Hi, Kennedy. Former President Trump says the nuclear story is not real. There's no truth to it. We'll see what comes out of this. As far as releasing the documents, he said he wants to release them. It's up to his attorneys if they will release them. They may do it by today. We know, though, this is an unusual move, though, to see an attorney general publicly talk about an ongoing case. But you know what? This is an unusual circumstance. There's no doubting that, involving the former president.
First, I personally approved the decision to seek a search warrant in this matter. Second, the department does not take such a decision lightly. Where possible, it is standard practice to seek less intrusive means as an alternative to a search and to narrowly scope any search that is undertaken.
Attorney General Garland said he decided to come out publicly and speak about the case because of the public interest. He was under intense pressure, political and public pressure, to say something.
All Americans are entitled to the even-handed application of the law, to due process of the law, and to the presumption of innocence. Much of our work is by necessity conducted out of the public eye.
Kennedy, Fox News has learned Trump's office was served a secret grand jury subpoena in early June when a top Justice Department FBI team visited Mar-a-Lago. Those investigators toured the area of the Florida estate where some of the documents were stored, then briefly viewed and took custody of a small amount of potentially sensitive material. Sources also say federal investigators had spoken with at least one person who relayed the possibility of more sensitive national security material in that storage room and other areas of the property. What we're waiting on, Kennedy and everyone on the panel, is the unsealed search warrant. It will have some details. It will have a list likely of what was taken from the property. It won't have the nitty-gritty details. That will be in the affidavit. That is still sealed, and there's no telling if the judge would ever consider unsealing the affidavit, which, of course, contains the probable cause. Kennedy.
Okay, great. We'll be waiting. Can't wait for that to drop. Great reporting. Thank you, David.
You're welcome.
So, Sean, let's talk a little bit about this. The Attorney General, who seems surprised that he's the Attorney General, and, you know, he's the #1 guy at the Justice Department. Did he say enough yesterday?
First of all, he's surprised he's not on the Supreme Court. If we recall, he was supposed to be on the Supreme Court. Donald Trump won election and then said, hey, you're not my guy, I'm going to pick somebody else. So we may have a little grudge against Donald Trump, but we learned nothing in that 5-minute press conference. But to be fair, we probably shouldn't have learned much from that press conference. But here's what concerns me is when you have these unnamed sources talking to the Washington Post saying, this is about nuclear documents. You saw this, Kaylee. You lived this for 4 years, where Donald Trump had unnamed sources saying a whole bunch of false information about him, and in the end it wasn't true. So you drive, this is what the media does and Democrats do, they drive a narrative. Donald Trump took highly classified nuclear secrets, had them at Mar-a-Lago, and they don't hear the correction. They don't hear the actual truth as it comes out, and that's the game that Democrats play and the media plays, which frustrates me, which is why I don't give a lot of credence to the story. I want to hear it come out. But Donald Trump was willing to cooperate. You already heard in the reporting, they served a subpoena, they went in, they took documents, they looked at documents. Donald Trump gave them to them. He was cooperating by evidence of just this report. Why not just go, hey, Donald, you got a few of these secret documents in regard to nuclear weapons, hand them over, and I'm sure he would.
Have you talked to anyone inside the inner circle, and how are they feeling about who might have tipped off federal investigators?
So I have not talked to anyone in Trump world about this. However, I've read, a wide array of reporting on it. And Politico Playbook, which, as you know, very respected, insidery Washington, D.C. publication that most politicos read every single morning before they go to Congress or the West Wing, they said this, and it caught me a little by surprise. I think it's extraordinarily fair on the part of Politico, but they said these two sentences, which are right. There were few other nuke details in the piece, and we've seen enough times when Trump scandals in the last 7 years that sometimes seem potentially explosive in their allegation. By an anonymous source, these stories fail to detonate. So interesting terminology they use there, but they're exactly right. And I did live this. I lived through Lafayette Square. I was there. We were told one thing, and then an inspector general report came out that dismissed it all. Much little fanfare outside of this network in covering the cleanup. COVID lab leak story, which was dismissed as categorically false, in fact now is entertained as a real, credible, and likely theory, Russian bounties, which Biden's own intelligence community came out and dismissed. These were all stories I lived through, anonymous sources that turned out to be different later. I proceed with caution, particularly when the Washington Post sourcing is people familiar with the investigation, people who describe some of the material but did not offer additional details about the type of information that's directly from the Washington Post report. That's not detailed sourcing to the level of 3 anonymous sources, senior level in the FBI, who are directly working on the investigation. That's a little evasive. So my point is, let's wait for the facts to come out. There is a history, according to Politico, and they're right, of stories on anonymous sources that turn out not to be true. So let's wait for something called facts, which many networks don't wait for, and proceed to, as I heard James Clapper last night, go ahead and entertain that this is somehow a Russia, Putin-related document that Trump took. I'm paraphrasing him there, but he jumped to Russia, and I think we've all learned jumping to Russia sometimes doesn't end well for the mainstream media.
No, but that's pure speculation. And that's the problem because, you know, there's fact and then there's speculation, but there are people reporting as though the speculation is fact. And, you know, that's part of the problem with the lag and knowing what happened is people fill up that vacuum with their own ideas. So what are you expecting? We're not gonna get the affidavit. We're not going to get anything about the source, you know, who very likely could have been a Secret Service agent, a sworn federal officer who could have spoken with colleagues. But what are you expecting to see in that search warrant?
There's a lot of things it could be. And it's interesting that, of course, it's within 100 days of an election. They've had these boxes. They've known what's been happening for 18 months. So there's some things that are facts that are on the record. We also know that President Trump has a better record, as we've discussed, when it comes to speaking the truth. He was called, you know, an idiot and bombastic for saying he was being wiretapped at Trump Tower. Lord knows he was. So the things, it's not just that things are said that are untrue, but when he says something else or pushes back or says something new, that's blasted as the false element. So I think what we've seen and what the American people have seen, and this is what should disturb everyone, regardless of what you think of President Trump, we now simply don't believe what our government is telling us. We have seen this happen. And perhaps, yes, the target is Donald Trump, the most lied about man in this country, the most targeted. Beyond that, what the government seems to have been willing to do to target him is what is shocking. And yes, if they are doing it to him, one of the richest men in the country, one of the most powerful, likely a candidate again, former president, it tells you that there's a comfort level with breaking those kinds of regulations and rules via the most prevalent example is the Russia dossier, the hoax, with these same agencies involved, the same media. We are now Charlie Brown, and the government is Lucy, and standing there asking us once again to kick that football, and we fall for it. We must stop falling for it. We must not become cynical, but we must stop and not let gossip. This is gossip, most of what is being pushed by the same media outlets that pushed the gossip as true, interestingly, perhaps deliberately, to allow that vacuum to fill with wonderings and imaginations, and you fill up with your own little details. As what are we now, 88 days away from the midterm elections, when Donald Trump may announce whether he's running for president or not? The entire system is being manipulated by individuals, I think it's safe to say, do not mean or have the best interests of everyone involved here, because there certainly would have been other ways to approach this situation than what we saw.
Hey everyone, I'm Emily Campagno. Catch me and my co-hosts Harris Faulkner and Kaylee McEnany on Outnumbered every weekday at 12 p.m. Eastern, or set your DVR. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page for daily highlights.